thanks so much for choosing to attend this session. My name is Claire Parker, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about the research I collaborated on this summer in Claire Kremen's Environmental Science Policy and Management Lab on two interrelated ecological factors, which are biodiversity and biodiversity. And we did this by examining the response of native insect pollinators to fire in Yosemite National Park. So basically, when my friends and family wanted to know what I'd been doing all summer and why I hadn't been answering phone calls, I could say honestly, I've been hiking around Yosemite looking at bugs. So you get a lot of interest in what you're doing when you walk around a national park with a giant net in your hand. And the most typical question I got from hikers was something like, what are you doing, catching butterflies? They thought it was hilarious. And I kind of thought it was hilarious to like hop out of the bushes with a net. So the answer is kind of, but it's a little more complicated than that. Butterflies are pollinating insects, but it's a much bigger picture. So like I said, our study looks at the effects of biodiversity on biodiversity. And these are relatively simple terms, but to understand the research, you really need to know the differences and the main points. So biodiversity is basically the varying responses of an ecosystem to fire, particularly a conifer forest like the mixed fern and pine habitat that makes up Yosemite, at least the higher elevations. Biodiversity, on the other hand, is the variety of life forms within a defined boundary, which can refer to genetic diversity within a species or diversity of species and groups within an ecosystem spatially. So, the effects of biodiversity on biodiversity, it means what happens after fire to things that live in the forest. And as Scott made really good points in his talk, fire is very important to forest health. Now, since their inception, the National Park Service and Forest Service have sort of historically practiced methods of complete suppression and complete suppression control in their fire management. And everyone knows the Smokey the Bear image, right? Only you can prevent wildfires. Well, images like that and that sort of mentality of completely controlling fire has led to this sort of cultural perception in the States of fire as demonic and fire as evil. And people look at a burned forest and they see a dead forest. And while fire management is a very tricky subject, especially concerning human property and life around wilderness areas like the Rim Fire in Yosemite right now, in an ecological sense, fire is really good for forests, and it's part of this bigger picture of forest succession. So what you might imagine as a forest, the lush conifers or deciduous trees, is really only the climax community at the very end of the forest. And the whole ecosystem picture includes a large succession of stages, which are really important in the life cycle of the forest. So you might still be wondering, what does this have to do with bees? Which is a good question. So basically, we're really lucky in California to have amazing biodiversity in plants and insects alike. So looking to the insect community for an indicator of biodiversity is a really, really good measure. Of the 4,000 native species in the United States, native species of bees, 1,600 are described in California alone, which is an enormous number. And just to go over the major families, there's Andrenidae, Halictidae, which come in these really cool colors, Apidae, which contains the groups honeybees, carpenter bees, bumblebees, all the bees you probably think of when you think of bees. Caliidae, which ingest pollen internally. They've actually developed internal pollen storage instead of external sacs. And my favorite in the middle, Megachilidae, which are endearingly called the hairy belly bees because they have hair on the other side of their thorax, which they store their pollen on. So as you can see, there's an amazing diversity of behaviors and life forms in this small group of insects, which is only a portion of pollinators. And when you throw in the complexity of all their interrelationships with flowering plants and all the coevolutions that exist there, you get a really broad picture of biodiversity, therefore making it a good factor to study if you want to include a more holistic picture of forest health. So the follow-up question I would get after, are you catching butterflies? And I would explain, no, it's mostly bees, would be, hey, what's happening to the honeybees? Because that's what most people have heard of, is this crisis in agriculture called pollen collapse disorder, where honeybees are disappearing en masse. So since my lab studies native pollinators, honeybees as a European introduced species do not really fall under the scope of our research, but they are pretty connected because these areas where, I should mention, the species Apis mellifera, which is a European species, is the sole pollinator used in most agriculture. All across the world, you'll find the same species in Europe, in America, North America, South America, everywhere. So from an ecological standpoint, that's really not good. We're putting all of our eggs in one bee basket and really not allowing all the diversity of native pollinators that exist to do their thing, which is what my lab works on in agriculture, is a more diversified system. So, although this project doesn't have to do specifically with agriculture, we also want to study in the forest fire regimes how environmental conditions can create suitable habitat for native pollinators. Where do they want to live? What floral resources do they need? And how can we enable this with our management practices? We want to create, as I said, a broader image of forest health through unexplored measures of biodiversity, including the whole community. So flowering vegetation and life forms before that, and in between that and the conifer forest. It's kind of been the tradition to look at just the macro flora of adult trees in forestry and fire measures, and we want to help provide a bigger picture. And eventually we would like to help make recommendations for future fire management in the national parks. So, to get into the sampling and what it actually looks like, we collaborated with the Fire Ecology Lab to select sites of high, medium, and low severity in pairs of 3 and in one area to be able to compare them. So, some images of what those look like. And so it's 18 sites total, 6 pairs of high, medium, and low sites that we sampled 4 times throughout the field season to get proper replication in our sampling and be able to take an accurate average of the actual pollinator community that exists there. We recorded vegetative conditions, so all of the plant species that existed in our plots. And this is the fun part, what did we actually do? What do people do when they sample pollinators? Well, I would walk around with this net around the plot, and when I saw a flying insect visiting a flower, I would run after it and catch it with the net. And then slip it into one of these lovely cyanide kill jars, because we have to collect all of the pollinators and have a record of what they were visiting. We also employed pan trapping, which is basically small colored cups that are supposed to resemble flowers and attract insects, which they then fly into and die. So, although our field portion just ended, and we still have a whole year of lab work at least ahead of us, but we were able to make some early results and observations, just observational data from being in the plots. So one of these that really stuck out was just by seeing the vegetation there. The high severity sites, with not much still standing, most of the ground either bare or covered in down wood, didn't prove very florally interesting. As you might imagine, if it's covered in down wood, there isn't much chance for things to grow. Or if it's really bare, they tended to get dominated with ceanothus, which is back here, or manzanita, or other shrubby species, which do flower, but there's not a very wide array. And it was really boring to sit there. And the low severity sites where fire had just passed through or not knocked many trees down, the canopy is still very dense, and the ground is covered in so much litter that, again, flowering plants don't have much of a chance. But just like Goldilocks and the 3 bears, medium severity sites are right on the money. And when there are still trees standing and the ground is clear enough, we're still testing, like why, what are the conditions that make this so beneficial for a wide array of flowering plants, they were the most interesting in our observations. They would have up to 20 species of flowering plants just in one 50 by 50 meter plot, and would just be completely abuzz. You would run around catching like 10 bumblebees with one swing. So this makes a lot of sense. In ecology, it's called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, when a disturbance in an ecosystem that is neither too severe nor too inconsequential provides really good opportunity for change and development. So yeah, something about the balance is just right. And a couple other interesting things we noticed was that the European honeybee I've discussed was found in all 18 of our sampling sites, which is surprising. And the park personnel that we reported this to, primarily, they were really interested because as an introduced species and as a managed species, they're not sure exactly how it happened, but honeybees must have escaped from managed hives and kind of gone feral into the park and reestablished wild communities. So it could be really interesting to follow up on genetics or on a population study of the honeybees, the colonies in the area basically, to see their effect on the native pollinators that already exist, and sort of the succession of like how did this invasion, so to speak, happen. And also, although we collect pollinators based on the flowers they're visiting, so purely on a pollination basis, we did notice that the groups of bees we were getting, the genera of bees, were a lot of wood nesting bees, which means that they inhabit existing holes in dead wood. They find dead wood with holes in it, and then they build a little solitary nest, because non-colonial species live in individual nests. So this makes sense for an area of dead wood, wood nesting bees. It was a really cool correlation to see. So we still have a year at least of lab work ahead of us, and it will be a lot of species identification, because to really draw the correlations between species in the area, vegetation, and what it means in regards to different severity plots, you need to get everything to species. And this can be really hard, so we'll work with expert taxonomists and look at a lot of bees under microscopes for a long time. And from that, yeah, we can hopefully make some correlations between the different severity plots. And again, what does this mean in application? Well, as we noticed, the medium sets did seem to be more interesting. And we can't say anything from that yet. But considering the current fire management practices, which include control burns, which does clear ground litter, and in places like Yosemite and Yellowstone now, which is a newer practice, but a let it burn policy, which says that wildfires and naturally occurring, like from lightning strike, that aren't threatening human life or property, should be allowed to burn until they naturally put themselves out. And this is sort of in response to that whole suppression, control, fire regime that I discussed earlier. And it's an experimental one in a lot of ways that we're trying out in certain national parks. And if we discover that the medium severity sites are actually the best for regenerating forests, that could change, because if you only have low and high disturbed areas, you're not allowing the large diversity of forms to repopulate. So I would like to thank Claire Kremen and her lab, Laura Fenicio, whose PhD project this is, Kate Wilkin, who's in the Scott Stevens lab and helped us identify most of our plants, the Student Conservation Association for providing interns, UC Berkeley, the CERT program in Rose Hills, for giving me this grant, which I used to hire a mule to pack in all of our supplies to Yosemite. Thank you.